talk.
137.
It would be safe to say in the investment world, change isn't coming. It's already here.
The world has been galvanized into action. What can we do to contribute to a more equitable society?
The future belongs to those who adapt, those who identify shortcomings and unlock value.
A quantum leap was necessary.
I think you understate the situation. It isn't necessary. It's essential if we're to build any kind of a future.
We have to ask ourselves, what can we do to invest in the right places, for the right reasons? Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the only thing to do.
Six trillion rands is what South Africa needs to unlock much needed social and economic infrastructure that will get the wheels of this economy turning again and lead to recovery and job creation. And to this end, the South African government has established an infrastructure fund which should help to roll out no less than 100 billion rands each year over the next 10 years to build much needed roads, railway lines, perhaps new renewable energy on the grid, and also to invest in more broadband for this envisaged digital economy. Now, African leaders have been pledging to invest more in infrastructure over the next few decades because this is, according to the United Nations, the decade for African development. But the money's been hard to come by. And the issue is this: bankable projects. The kinds of projects that would bring together the government, the private sector, and development finance institutions, all seeing the opportunity, all willing to pay that risk. And so what are needed are inventive solutions to support visionary policy and to incentivize the private sector to come in as a corporate citizen and build infrastructure for good. That is our theme in this edition of Critical Conversations, the kind of infrastructure that is going to change your life and my life. So to that end, we've established and set up a great panel of experts who are well versed on issues of policy and investment and asset management to talk to us about what opportunities exist within this area of social and economic infrastructure to really take the South African economy to a new level, the leap that's needed for economic recovery, especially in a post-COVID world. So let me introduce you to them. First off, we have Catherine Kaufman. Catherine is the Group Executive for Project Preparation at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. She's also joined virtually by Ndabe Mkhize, who is the founding chairman of the Asset Owners Forum for South Africa. He joins us from the United States. We're also joined in studio by Ockert Doyer, who is the head of credit at Sanlam Investments, and he's also the portfolio manager for Sanlam Investments Sustainable Infrastructure Fund. And then, unfortunately, we were scheduled to have Dr. Hosienso Ramokgopa, who is the head of infrastructure for South Africa in the Office of the President, but due to an unforeseen circumstances, he's not able to join us today. But we will reflect on the plans for a new infrastructure fund in South Africa and a national infrastructure plan in the context of the country's national development priorities. And so, as we said, our focus today is infrastructure for good. It is our conversation here in studio, but it is a conversation we also encourage you to participate in. And so we urge you, please join the conversation using the hashtag Critical Conversations, also hashtag Infrastructure for Good. tag us at Sanlam Invest, and also make sure that you use your chat facility on the platform to raise your questions, bring in your comments, and be part of this conversation. And let's get this conversation trending on social media, #critical conversations. It is a much needed debate about economic recovery, about job creation, using the infrastructure that is around us. So without further ado, let's talk. First and foremost, Ndabe in the United States, Arkert, and also Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. Catherine, let's start with you, just very quickly. Is infrastructure the much-needed silver bullet for South Africa and its recovery?
Good morning. Thanks for the invitation to talk to you. Well, I believe our social ills and our socioeconomic ills are very complex. I'm not sure that infrastructure investment solves it all. What I do know is that the differentiator between developing and developed countries is quality infrastructure.
Yeah.
So an investment into infrastructure is an investment into humanity. Those who are the recipients of that infrastructure will benefit from it, have their standards of living raised, and it restores them a level of dignity.
Yeah, there's nothing as simple as being able to open a tap and get your water or turn on the switch, and there's electricity. Arkert, is it the silver bullet?
Good morning, Larata, and good morning to my fellow panelists. I think if we're serious about fighting unemployment and if we're serious about fighting poverty in South Africa, this is the best weapon in our arsenal. So I would say it is.
Ndabe, is this the thing that's going to be a game changer?
Well, if you look at the world inflation rate, it's double what it was in the past. If you look at the growth rate, it's half what it was. And if you look at the fact that whenever armies are fighting, the first thing they do is destroy infrastructure. It goes to show that it is it, and it can result in not only good returns and acceptable risks, but also it can drive impact. So it's something that we definitely need.
Reminding us of its strategic value and its impact. And perhaps this is a great place to begin, Catherine, when we say, why must we elevate the issue of infrastructure in our national conversations, in our national discourse? We talk about everything else, but we don't really ever talk about why it's important to have dams and railway lines and roads when we're talking poverty or job creation.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about job creation. It directly addresses the socioeconomic challenges that we have. Our unemployment rate is at about 34% now, slightly down from where it was in the last period. That's not much, considering that it leaves 7.9 million people still unemployed. The youth themselves are a large component of that as well. So from that perspective, it's imperative, and the opportunities are immense because we've got such major infrastructure backlogs in terms of underserviced areas, but as well as existing infrastructure that needs refurbishment. So the opportunity to make inroads into job creation are absolutely massive. And I think the second really important issue is that it allows citizens to participate in their social economic ecosystem. Once you put down a piece of infrastructure, if you put down a road between two cities, you connect the cities. Small economies form around that road. Shops, housing, schools, they need to be connected with ICT. So in doing so, in creating more jobs, you add to the tax base, which is extremely important for reinvestment into social infrastructure and more jobs. For me, what I see is becoming more and more prevalent, and there are naysayers, but the writing's on the wall. Infrastructure is now about truly impacting communities for building infrastructure that's resilient. If you look at what happened in KZN, and KZN received the headlines, but there are other communities that suffered. Resilient infrastructure, impactful infrastructure, green infrastructure for the future, sustainable infrastructure is equally important in creating
What do you mean by
jobs.
resilient infrastructure? Because when Mother Nature unleashes her wrath and it destroys a bridge and it destroys roads, it's not for lack of the quality of infrastructure built by the engineers. It's just the power of nature around you.
Yes, but the reason why this is happening is because of climate change.
Yeah.
So resilient infrastructure also means infrastructure that allows you access to funding, that you can invest into infrastructure that will not be a stranded asset in the future. A stranded asset meaning that that infrastructure will be either destroyed because of climate change in the way it was built, or it will not find partners for investment later on. Once you close down those factories after a flood or it's washed away, there are very few partners that are going to be left to reinvest in that infrastructure if it's a stranded asset, if it's an asset that lends itself to a carbon-intensive industry.
Okay, I understand what you mean there. So investing in infrastructure that supports businesses of the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we are in a post-COVID recovery period, and what's really needed, because the economy is battered and people have really just suffered under COVID, and businesses that have had to be shut down, is the kinds of things that are going to catalyze this recovery, and not short-term but long-term. How can infrastructure support that?
Well, I think that what we found, and this is, we must give credit to our presidency, what we found is that it was very clear, even before COVID, that we were struggling, that the economy was struggling. The opportunity that COVID brought is that it allowed us to reset in how we rebuild ourselves. Just before we went into lockdown, the presidency called a meeting at Tenhays, inviting all industry leaders, technical partners, financial partners, policy makers, and launched what was now become ISA, the Infrastructure South Africa.
Right.
In doing that, what we were saying is that we are now going to focus on regenerating the economy, focused on infrastructure.
Right.
Developing new skills, capacitating the state, and of course making sure that that infrastructure is investable for the world community, not just South Africa.
Ndabi, let me bring you into the conversation now and underscore economic recovery. I feel like I've heard this word infrastructure for a long time. I feel like every budget I've ever heard a finance minister deliver, whether Trevor Manuel, whether Tito Mboweni, Pravin Gordon, hey, even Malusi Gigaba, I've heard that word infrastructure. So the issue is this, is if we know what needs to be done, why hasn't it been done, and why is there this urgency right now?
Well, it takes two to tango. If you look at what is really needed is a framework like public-private partnerships, which basically entail a public entity partnering with a private entity in order to deliver some services. It has to start with the public sector understanding their objectives and being able to reach out to the private sector so that they can transfer that risk from the public sector to the private sector. So while things have been done in the past, for example, things in healthcare, infrastructure, in prisons, in toll roads, actually even some government accommodation in the early 2000s, I think we lost momentum towards the end of 2009 to 2010. And I think the skill set needed in places like the PPP unit, those skill sets became, lost to the public sector.
Right.
So I think that's why it didn't happen. But if you look at the fact that most of the problems that were already being seen in 2006
Right.
as an investment in rail, investment in road, investment in healthcare and digital infrastructure, and those actually didn't happen between 2006 and 2022, so we are playing catch up.
Right.
The political will is always needed to get these things going.
Right.
And I believe that now we have run out of time. We certainly need to get going.
Playing catch up occurred, and as South Africa plays catch up, the environment has changed in that the infrastructure that's needed now needs to be sustainable and greener. This is the new world. And so is this an opportunity, as Catherine has said, to reset and build better, or do you need to complete what's in the pipeline?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, unfortunately, when we look at the media articles and news articles around infrastructure in South Africa, we see, it being mentioned how the infrastructure is deteriorating and the lack of maintenance that's been done. And that is unfortunate. But it's not as though we don't have world-class infrastructure in South Africa as well. And I want to use one or two examples. And the first one is the N3 toll road between KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. You know, Gauteng being the economic heartland of South Africa, and the port, you know, one of the busiest ports in South Africa. And that N3 toll road has really improved the efficiency in which goods could be, you know, moved between these two economic hubs. And by improving that efficiency, it's not just about exporters being able to export their goods more efficiently or that, but it really has an impact on the price at which things are available in the supermarket. So it does have an impact on normal, you know, citizens and their ability to have access to affordable goods and that sort of thing. I think another example is the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. That's been a massively successful program. South Africa managed to add more than 6,000 megawatts to its power grid very successfully over the last few years. And there are a few components of that program that has been copied elsewhere in the world, really as a result of the success of that program. So I think we do have to acknowledge that there are some good infrastructure in South Africa as well. But I see you want to interject
as you said, the Independent Power Producer Program, and it's added 6,000 megawatts, and I'm thinking, but my lights were out yesterday. Am I missing something?
No, unfortunately, you know, as we speak, I think we're on stage 4 load shedding, you know, so that is an unfortunate thing, but it comes back to the point that Ndabe made. We are playing catch up. Unfortunately, you know, we haven't been investing nearly enough in infrastructure overall, but specifically in terms of energy. And unfortunately, you know, these projects do have quite long lead times. So even if we had, you know, even if we make all the right decisions now and we start to invest now, you know, it will take a few years until we see the results. But I think the first few steps have been taken, and I think we are really moving in the right direction, slowly but surely.
Okay, Ndabe, let's bring you in here and let's go back to the point you've raised about the importance of public-private partnerships. So we know the government's role is to create an enabling environment. If there's an enabling environment, then the private sector has an incentive to participate and commercialize opportunities. And when that happens, then perhaps there's an efficiency in the way in which services are delivered. So that's theoretically how it happens. Practically, what's actually going on?
Practically, everything starts with a political will, so that things don't stop and start. So when there's a political will to get things done, they will happen. The right legislative environment is going to be there, and it will ensure that it brings in the right people in the private sector to be able to participate. Really, it's been a case of things being suggested that actually could go the PPP route, but that has not happened. I mean, just look at low-hanging fruit, for example, like government accommodation. That is very, very easy to do. Instead of government complaining that they are paying 300 rands per square meter a month, they should have been able to do PPPs in that government accommodation. That would have been at least half the cost of that. And it's not a complicated thing to do. Look at REIPP. It actually started and then it stopped. Okay. Why did it stop? Because there was a lack of political will regarding renewable energy. We are blowing hot and cold on it. So the practical thing is actually we need government to come to the party. Now that things are actually deteriorating, and the lights, water, and action is very much needed. I think you're going to see a lot of that happening. The private sector is now doing its own, fire brigade. I never thought I'd see that day, but when your house is on the line and you're not so sure whether there's going to be water pressure to actually be able to douse the fire, you tend to take matters to your own hands, just like we've done with our own private security. So I think now it's time to make sure that we're doing that with rail, with road, with healthcare, with education. We should not be having schools that have asbestos, and they're still there.
Ndabe, you're saying quite a few things here. The first one I want to know is, if only now sort of the private sector maybe is getting off the fence from which it's been sitting to participate, does it mean that more trust is being established between the government and the private sector? Because we've had a period in South Africa where the private sector and the government just didn't trust each other.
Yes. Actually, the other side of the coin is that the private sector was also missing in action. If you think about it, you needed the private sector to actually be able to suggest ways it could invest. So I think with the creation of the Asset Owners Forum, we've basically been able to bring in pension funds and to also be able to talk to government about the type of project that can actually be done. So I think those engagements, which are basically trying to make sure that there's an enabling environment, the Regulation 28, the creation of the necessary tax dispensation so that you can invest in this, and making sure that the projects have got good governance, have got ESG, and all these are things that go with it. That goes a long way towards encouraging the public sector to invest, and more importantly, and actually being able to do that in a manner that makes pension funds want to invest and play catch up with global markets, because globally, 26% of all pension funds assets are allocated to infrastructure and private markets. In South Africa, that's a low single-digit number, even though this asset class has good returns. So there was also something happening with our own private sector not wanting to come to the party.
We'll talk about the numbers in a second. It's still the principle for me, Catherine. And Ndaba says, the private sector is now coming to the party, but you've got to ask yourself a question when the private sector becomes the fire brigade, because the fire brigade doesn't have the trucks and the water, when the private sector is the one filling up the potholes, as is happening in my neighborhood, or even building the schools, does that absolve the government of its responsibility? Aren't there basic public goods that the government is responsible for, even on the infrastructure side, and then different kinds of investments that the private sector can make?
So the model we choose to deliver infrastructure is not varied. It must work for us in our context. And I agree that a lot has shifted to the private sector. But it's where we are today, it's very clear that we need to co-create, co-solution, and take co-responsibility. There are certain things that we are uniquely positioned to do independently because of how we capitalized, whether it's public sector or private sector. So yes, government, especially as a DFI, Development Finance Institution, we have very specific roles. We have the role of, first of all, making sure that we step into gaps where private sector is uncomfortable.
Okay.
We make sure that we make the market. So the IPP program, for instance, that Orchid mentioned, the procurement model was funded initially by the DBSA. It's incubated at the DBSA. And the DBSA is a state-owned entity, so it makes sense that it happens there. Similarly, the infrastructure fund, which is a blended finance platform, also it's incubated at the DBSA at the moment, but that in itself is where government took leadership, the political will that we're talking about, championship through ISA, through Infrastructure South Africa, is where government stepped in positively, intentionally to lead the way in terms of delivering infrastructure to the country.
Okay, so there's been some kind of a sea change, is what you're trying to say. Okay, I want to talk about the reforms that Ndabe mentioned to create that enabling environment. You know, in the last year, we've seen a lot happening. The measures taken for the private sector to add to the national grid their surplus energy, the spectrum auctions that everybody's been talking about, and, you know, even the report on state capture, just bringing it to a conclusion for us to understand how to plug those gaps for wastage and governance. Is that all enough to sort of say to the private sector, okay, we can do business with this government? Because as anonymous attendee asks, is PPP, will it work where the government is considered to be competent and honest and a reliable partner? So is this government considered to be honest and reliable?
I think the policy reforms that we have seen is massively positive. I think, you know, if you just take the energy reforms, you know, previously if you were an independent power producer and you wanted to, you know, build a manufacturing facility, a power producer's facility, power plant, any power plant above 1 megawatt, and that's actually quite a small facility, needed a license. At the moment, you can build a facility up to 100 megawatts without requiring a license. So that sort of reform is really positive. I think the way in which the energy markets are liberated at the moment will really have a massive, massive positive impact. maybe not next year, but over the next 10 years. And I think we need to understand that these policy reforms and the impact of the policy reforms will take a while. But these are big steps that have been taken. Now, whether the private sector will see the government as a responsible partner, I think the relationship between the government and the private sector has definitely improved over the last 2 years. I think we've seen a real breakdown in the relationship, as part of the previous administration, but at the moment we're really seeing a positive relationship developing between the private and the public sector.
Okay, I don't want to belabor this point. Ndabe, I have a question, which is this. Let's take the politics out of the equation and just look at what happened when we talk about the loss of momentum. South Africa was coming out of a global recession like any other country in the world, and a lot of the money that was coming into the kitty was going towards infrastructure maintenance as opposed to capital expenditure on brand new infrastructure. It's just really a function of the market at the time, the debts at the time, and what could be done rand for rand. So what is changing by way of unlocking opportunities and loosening the purse strings that makes it possible now to build infrastructure as opposed to maintain infrastructure?
The capital of the state has been constrained, both in terms of skill sets and also budget. I think what is changing now is basically catalyzing the funds from institutional investors like insurance companies and pension funds by creating a right framework. And that is step number one. Step number two is also ensuring that you can catalyze or crowd in international money. International funds will only invest if they see local pension funds and local institutional investors investing. So actually, by creating something like the infrastructure fund and setting aside 100 billion rands, what the South African government is doing is actually being able to catalyze even more than just 100 billion, because there'll be 5 trillion rands in pension fund assets. Well, not all of that will be in infrastructure, but if 15 or 20% of that made its way, it would be another trillion. And then when transatlantic pension funds, and right now I'm actually in the States attending the NASP conference, when the international pension funds see that we've got a framework to invest and we've got local pension funds to invest, that money will come in. So that is something different, Lerato, that was not there before.
And to that point, Orkert, certainly if I was invested in a pension fund, I'd be happy for you as asset managers to decide where there can be yield. But I would not be happy for you to put my money, my savings, into an asset like Eskom. So when we're talking governance in this infrastructure environment, what are we talking about? Where are the opportunities? Because what people don't want is their savings going into a dark hole.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that is actually one of the benefits of getting the private sector involved in the rollout of the infrastructure program that we're busy with. As soon as the private sector gets involved, there's just a whole new level of governance that is involved. If private sector puts their money to use, where we invest in these infrastructure projects, we look at the operational reports on effectively a monthly or quarterly basis. As soon as the information becomes available, we want to see whether the project is actually doing what it said it would initially do. Whereas very often, if you only have the government involved, they would invest the money and there wouldn't be that almost ongoing oversight and governance involved. So I think we have to be responsible with the savings of the pension pools that we have to our disposal. And but by getting the private sector involved, I think that is one of the key benefits. It's not just the capital that comes in, but the expertise in rolling out the infrastructure and then also the governance.
And then finally, just to sort of collate our thoughts in this aspect of the conversation, Catherine, Dieketseng says, do we have a standard holistic climate and green approach plan for industries to adapt regarding infrastructure? So we're talking infrastructure for good, sustainable, resilient infrastructure. It's a government policy, but is it something that has really filtered through across South African industry?
Yes, I believe it has. We have, through our National Treasury, we've just issued the taxonomy for green infrastructure. It's almost like the rule book. So if you want to invest in sustainable infrastructure, it will identify what that looks like as opposed to what's greenwashing, dressed up as green infrastructure. And for investors, that's important because you know that that asset will find partners in terms of co-investing, in terms of technical investment as well. So there is a taxonomy that's available, and of course the government also has various policy papers on hydrogen, on our net zero statement for 2050. So there is information available, and it's available on most of our websites, National Department websites.
And I know you're not government, but seeing as you're somewhere in between, you know, as a DFI, is there a specific plan to fast-track water infrastructure improvement at the municipal level? The current Public Finance Management Act-based processes will not address the urgency of this. So I just think this is about flexibility. There's policy and then there's getting stuff done.
Yes, just to correct you, I'm actually government. Because the DBSA is 100%, it's our shareholder, it's the state. But we are the bridge
say that too loudly.
We are the bridge between public and private sector.
Yeah.
We're the bridge between public and private sector. So, yes, there is a national water program with many sub-programs below it. It was initiated at the DBSA. Usually a state-owned entity will come to us and say, we're looking to roll out a particular program or project pipeline. Can you assist with project development and preparation? In this instance, the National Water Program was developed at the DBSA, and it looks at non-revenue water, water and sanitation, even asset mine drainage and cleaning the waterbeds. So there is a program that we're currently working on that has been adopted by the Department of Water and Sanitation.
We need to see more of you wearing the government hat. It would make us feel better, South Africans. I'm being facetious. Okay, it's now time for us to ask you, as the audience on the platform, to participate in a poll. And our poll question is this: how would you describe social infrastructure? Remember, we're drawing a distinction between social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. So in this context, social infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals, you know, the stuff that we see as soft, but it's very, very important. Do you think our infrastructure in South Africa is world-class? Is it adequate? Or is it disappointing? So please vote now. The social infrastructure we're talking about, the clinics, the hospitals, the schools, is it world-class? Is it just enough? It's adequate? Or woefully, woefully disappointing? Please vote now, and then we will collate the results in just a short while as we start to consider other issues around the role of infrastructure in the country and really how to invest in a more deliberate way. I think deliberate is definitely the word of the season. I'm trying to get a hold of the results to see how we fare, and the results are this: 90% disappointing. People believe that social infrastructure in this country is disappointing. What do you say to that?
I think I would agree, unfortunately.
All the schools, all the hospitals, the clinics, disappointing.
I think the fact is that, you know, if you take people's lived experiences, if you think about social infrastructure, if you think about the, you know, we speak about bridges in rural areas that mean people get, you know, have access to well-functioning clinics, you know, where they can go to school that is well-functioning. You know, unfortunately, we have a two-tiered system in South Africa at the moment where, you know, take COVID as an example, you know, where education was sort of forced into a digital sort of way of educating, and there were schools and, you know, communities where they had the infrastructure to facilitate that, but there were millions of kids in South Africa that didn't have that ability, and they were sort of left behind during that. So in my view, social infrastructure, unfortunately, for many millions in South Africa is inadequate.
I think this is a good time to start talking about why it's important to think of a sustainable future, because that sustainable future does this. It doesn't just provide the much needed infrastructure, it also ensures that nobody is left behind. And so the best way to do it is investing with purpose, investing with confidence.
Confidence takes the lead. It says enough is enough. Confidence looks in the mirror and has the courage to say, we can do better, think bigger, look further, and find smart ways to invest in a more sustainable future. So confidence invests in people. It innovates and pushes boundaries. Confidence works hard and harder still to find investment solutions that make a meaningful difference to communities, our planet, and to our future. Confidence has integrity and vision. Confidence looks beyond wealth creation and finds a greater purpose. Confidence inspires a nation to invest in a future for all, a world where we can all flourish, or building a sustainable tomorrow. Because confidence knows a sustainable future is the best long-term investment we can make.
You're watching Critical Conversations brought to you by Sanlam Investments. My name is Lerato Mbele, and today we're talking about infrastructure for good. Social infrastructure and industrial economic infrastructure. The tools, as it were, that would get this economy moving again. Because South Africa is a middle-tier economy, is really not operating at par compared to its peers. It's an industrialized, advanced economy in the African context. But when you compare South Africa to Turkey, South Korea, Mexico, there's still so much that can be done. And that's so much that changes the quality of life for you and for me as citizens, for you as an entrepreneur, and really brings to the fore those who can give more value to investments as asset managers. And so let's continue our conversation, Oker Doya, and let's talk about the money and the role that infrastructure plays. We've referred very briefly to pension funds being perhaps the one place where government can start to source capital for investment in big bridges. I see a beautiful bridge behind you. And so let's just talk about that a little bit, because there are pools of money that exist in South Africa that haven't been tapped into.
Yeah, you're right. And Dabe also touched on it earlier. He's, as part of the Asset Owners Forum, asset owners being, the pension funds and the retirement funds in South Africa. And I think South Africa is in a very privileged position compared to some other African countries that we do have big savings pools. If you look at the amount of money available in our retirement funds, if you look at our banking system, we do have a lot of capital that's available, but it's about channeling that capital towards these infrastructure investments. And I think this is what the conversation is all about, and I think this is also what we're slowly but surely starting to see as the public and the private sector start to take hands. But the requirement is massive. The National Infrastructure Plan, if you look at the amount of investments that is needed over the next 20 years, I think you mentioned it earlier, I think they're speaking about 6 trillion rands of investment. The government wouldn't be able to fund it by itself. In the document, it says that, they think that they'd be able to fund about 2/3 of that. So there's a funding gap of at least 2 trillion rand for the private sector to step in. It's a big opportunity, but as part of the National Development Plan, they've also mentioned that we need to invest about 30% of our GDP into infrastructure type of projects. And we see that other emerging markets are doing it. We're seeing the likes of India and China, they're investing north of 40% in infrastructure-related investments. And look at what that has done to the economic growth rates. And we've been lagging behind. And as a result, we're seeing the really sluggish economic growth rates.
Before we get into some of the numbers, let's just distinguish what we mean by social and economic infrastructure. I just gave a very sort of a rudimentary explanation. It's building of schools versus the building of dams and bridges. But why do we need to make this distinction, and where are the incentives then for the private sector to come in? Because as I asked Catherine earlier on, isn't the building of a school something the government ought to be doing?
Yeah, I think what we see is that, I think part of the distinction, why we distinguish between economic and social infrastructure is almost, it comes back to the funding model that's available as a result of who eventually pays for that infrastructure. So if we think about economic infrastructure, at the end of the line, there's a user that actually pays for that infrastructure. So if you think about the electricity network, at the end of the day, there's a municipal bill that is sent out to a user, and they pay the bill, and you can follow the cash flows. Economic infrastructure effectively creates cash flow. And because there's a cash flow, it's easier for the private sector to then fund those, those assets, because you can follow the cash. We have social infrastructure. If you think about a clinic, think about schools, hospitals, those sort of things. There's no real end user with a bill except in the private sector where that can be followed. But there are funding solutions for that as well. We've seen internationally how social infrastructure can be funded through availability-based payments. So the private sector would, for example, build a school, and as long as the school is available, then the government will make a payment on a monthly basis. So there are ways of funding social infrastructure as well through a public-private partnership, and I think that's actually one, it's a great opportunity for the private sector to get involved in those investments.
I've often heard the term, and Catherine, you can come in, I've often heard the term blended finance. What is meant by that? Because it seems to me like where there isn't the cash flow, the real return on investment, then the government will make a payment. And then that's really where you need to be a little bit more agile with the financial tools.
I think that's quite a creative funding solution for, quite complex projects like we often find in infrastructure. So you have to start quite early, where there's still a lot of risk. There's no project, nothing exists, and you have to do the feasibility studies and the project planning and all of those things. Now, who's going to fund that? If the private sector funds those sort of things, there's a lot of risk, and the returns that they will require in order to fund that phase of the project is going to be immensely. And in fact, very often you don't find venture capitalist firms, in South Africa that's willing to fund that. And that's where you then have the public sector, development finance institutions like the DBSA that comes in. They can fund that. They can develop the project up to a certain stage where it's being de-risked sufficiently for the private sector to then come in and earn commercial returns from there onwards. But you need that. So the blended finance model is this idea about, concessionary financing or grant funding coming in early and, up to a certain point, and then the private sector with commercial funding requirements coming in later.
Catherine, I know you want to come in. Answer this. We also hear the word bankability, which is very important, and that a lot of projects that haven't come to fruition, it's because at that project preparation stage, it's when you start to see a lot of gaps. So just explain to us very briefly what goes into project preparation for us to get to a point where people say, yeah, the building of that dam is bankable.
So project preparation, which is where development finance institutions should play more.
Yeah.
Because we take care of the risk that Orchid would be worried about by making sure that we provide risk capital, because you don't know when you start preparing a project whether it's actually going to be bankable. That's part of the exercise of project preparation. So you invest risk capital as well as technical capacity into a project to make sure that it's something that's eventually investable. So when you talk about where funding's coming from for social infrastructure, there, especially there, development finance plays a significant role because we can structure in project preparation our role in being the market maker, that first concessional funding, bridging that funding, first loss activity around funding. We can step into that gap and hopefully get out of our own way and step out when the market can take over, because it's now something that's more commercial, like the REAP program, a lot more commoditized. I'm not saying we shouldn't be funding renewable projects as DFIs, but there is a big private sector market that's comfortable with the risk. So we should start moving along the value chain of energy supply to distribution, grid connection, everything else, because we've created that market, we've de-risked the market.
Okay, so there is a value chain of risk, essentially, is what you're saying.
There's a value chain of risk, and blended finance is the overlay to solving that.
Okay, we've just been schooled. Thank you. And I'm bringing you back into the conversation, and this refers to some of the numbers that you alluded to earlier on. The amount of money that South Africa spends as a proportion of GDP on infrastructure versus what their peers are doing. And a number I came across is that across the world, as you said, the average is 30% and above. In South Africa, it used to be 18%, and it's now down to about 12, 14%. So we keep on regressing. What are the problems here?
I think it's basically what we've seen with the lack of investment in infrastructure from government as well as from the private sector. And if you also look at the asset allocation of various institutional investors like pension funds into these assets, it's a low single-digit number. Compare and contrast that with what happens in the whole world. If you're looking at the large 22 large pension markets in the world, being Australia, the UK, United States, and whatnot, they are sitting at 26%. So clearly, if we want to see that ratio, grow from 12% to 18% and to 30%, we need to see the allocation to infrastructure and to real assets, actually, not just infrastructure. We need to see that allocation increasing and doubling. And that is why I think you're seeing government intervening and changing the Regulation 28 of the Pension Fund Act to allow pension funds to be able to put more money. There's still a lot more that can also be done on the tax dispensation, creating things like the unlisted REITs so that pension funds can invest in these tangible assets in a very tax efficient manner. I think if we do that, we're going to see that number increasing. Certainly, the Asset Owners Forum is existing to drive that percentage up.
I don't want to belabor this part of the conversation. I want us to get into the National Infrastructure Plan in a short while. But there are some questions for you specifically, Catherine, now that you've said you're a government representative. Jackie Steele says, unfortunately, the government representative has not been able to attend unfortunate circumstances. Infrastructure must be carefully selected if this money is actually going to be put to real use without corruption. And then in support almost of this principal anonymous attendee says, how will corruption and overspending be stopped in the infrastructure tender process or rollout of these projects?
Not unexpected. So I think it goes back to the procurement model. One thing that we haven't discussed is that the reason why we've seen less PPPs in the last administration, if you look at the state corruption, the report that came out, remember PPPs are very transparent.
Okay.
Besides providing you with technical competitive bids with regards to technical expertise, pricing, new technology, it's also very transparent. So when something goes wrong or something is not smelling very good, you see it very early on in the process. So I believe that the more PPPs we do, and I'm not saying that every infrastructure delivery model should be a PPP.
Yeah.
There's various permutations to that. But when we do that, transparency, intervention in terms of corruption is much more visible.
I mean, you can understand where all of this is coming from. Ndabe, let me bring you in, is that, you know, you look at the ESCOM issue, and here's a debt for one state entity of 378 billion rands. 378 billion with a B is the debt at ESCOM.
Yeah.
And how it's come about is that with the power stations that were being built, the projects that were meant to be 5 years into the making became 10 years into the making. They got more and more expensive into the making. And there were tenders for everything from boilers to toilet paper. And people just are sick and tired of getting played like this.
Actually, that's why we need good PPPs. And there are various models. I'll just pick on one, the infrastructure-based one, where government will tender in order to be able to make sure that not only can they get finance, but they can also get the skill set from the private sector to be able to deliver those projects on time and within budget. And the risk for getting it on time and within budget sits with the private sector. So guess what? It will not overshoot. And if it does, it will be the private sector that's actually in the dock. Right now, if it's government doing it, you know, a project doubles, it takes 8 years, no one gets fired. There's still apparently more money. So actually what we need is that transparency that Catherine was talking about, is having skin in the game, that if you're the private sector and you don't deliver a hospital or a toll road in time, your shareholders are going to suffer, and they will make sure that those heads roll. So I think people need to understand why it has not worked, and therefore start agitating for the things that will actually work.
I'm just a journalist. Honestly, if you ask me, I'd say just leave the government out of any of these things. But anyway, poll number 2. Let's ask you, our delegates, to participate. Would you describe the economic infrastructure in the country, roads, rails, ports, the big stuff, would you describe these in South Africa as world-class, enough, adequate, or disappointing? So now we're talking the real economic infrastructure, or let me not say the real, all of it is real, but the economic infrastructure that really unlocks the commercial opportunity, the roads, the rails, the ports, the power stations. Are they world-class? Are they adequate, or are they disappointing? Please vote now so that we know what you think and we can speak to some of your responses. That's as we prepare to talk about the National Infrastructure Plan of 2050 to see whether or not that's taking us forward in any which way. So the economic infrastructure, 14% say it's adequate, and 85% say it's disappointing. Fair reflections? Go on, Dabe.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think it's slightly better than social infrastructure because a large chunk of that infrastructure, like the ICT, is being done by mobile network towers and mobile network companies. If you look at a road, it's already in the PPP with N3 and N4. So a large chunk of it is actually working well. But if we're seeing potholes and seeing other things, people are still not satisfied. If you look at rail, it used to be good. It no longer is. And I think the common theme, even social infrastructure in yesteryear, it used to be good, but obviously was mismanaged. But it does seem to be slightly better than social infrastructure. I think that's when you see the involvement of the private sector as well as the public sector that actually makes sure that those ones work well.
Back to this whole point of confidence in the state. But, we won't bring in our personal biases. Let's talk about the state and let's understand what is the national infrastructure plan. Catherine, if I may ask you to help us here, what you're in the space and what do you understand the government trying to do through this plan?
Government's trying to develop, and this, by the way, was also something that was worked on by the Infrastructure South Africa,
right,
which is basically the champion for infrastructure delivery in the country. But what they're trying to do is build on the National Development Plan that we all know about, being more specific around a sector focus, a phased implementation. And so I think the difficulty we have today, which was probably different from the NDP, the original NDP, is that we do have a fiscus that is anemic. People say there's funding available. Yeah. From government side, we actually need partnerships with the private sector. So that's going to be the determining factor for success and innovation around the funding model for NIP 2050. It's going to be who's going to eventually, how are we going to recover cash flows or repayment of capital invested into these infrastructure projects.
And just from a cursory look, where do you think that money is going to come from?
Depending on the procurement model, we talk about a user pay system, which means that we will be collecting the money. If you, for instance, and I just want to mention that there's a lot of social infrastructure program that's currently being rolled out. Student accommodation, the basic education program, which is also providing school infrastructure, all of that will require some sort of payment. So if I build something, if I make a building available to you and it works and it's functional, I need to be paid a fee to use a levy, a unitary payment of some sort. So that money is going to come from the user, the end user. Now, it still begs the question, if the end user, if it's health, for instance, if the end user is the Department of Health, public sector, it still means we have to, as government, somehow underpin that payment. If it's for water, if the end user is a municipality, because no private sector entity will take a risk on me and you paying for the water, especially we are the state of municipalities are and jobs in the ratepayers in those municipalities. So you still have to be comfortable with the user that is going to offtake that service from you. But if we invest, if we make sure that we prepare a pipeline of projects in this space for NIP 2050 that is sustainable, that is resilient, that is impactful, the pools of funding available from pension fund, from asset managers, from the international community who are interested in transitioning infrastructure are endless.
Right. And obviously NIP 2050, I like that. We need to nip in the bud wastage for all those additional players to come into the system. Ockert and Ndabe, I'd like to raise something else, but I think related, and this is decentralization of infrastructure management. We're seeing sort of in the Western Cape a prototyping of the municipality taking over the railway lines, bringing in independent power producers in the transmission grids of the city, taking it out of Eskom's hand, taking out of the hands of PRASA, for instance, just those kinds of examples where they say, let us do it and let us directly provide services for our residents. Is that something that could work? And can municipalities raise money on the capital markets independently of the state?
I think it's an interesting development, and I actually think it's something that is needed in South Africa. And I think part of the reason for this is that these sort of things tend to gravitate towards where the skill set lies in order to roll these things out efficiently. And who is best placed? Who's the people in the Western Cape have? It's in their best interest that the infrastructure in the Western Cape, functions well. And so I think to some extent there's an alignment of interest. And I think if the local government or the local municipality can prove that they have the ability to deploy and to implement these infrastructure projects, I think it's fantastic. I think that decentralization is a model that will be tested. But if it works well, I think it's something that can be copied elsewhere.
And Ndaba, this is not about partisan interest. This is just about who actually can do this thing more efficiently. The municipality that's closer to the community, or the government that's further away, the national government that's further away.
Actually, if you look at things like education and healthcare, those are decided at provincial level, even though you've got a national department that always coordinates, but the approvals are done at provincial level. So it makes sense, for example, for any province, be it the Western Cape or KZN or whichever, to want to do something in the healthcare space or in the education space, and be able to run those those processes at that level. I think it makes a lot of sense. There certainly is international precedent. If you look at in Canada, I think the state of Alberta, you find that some of their healthcare, some of their hospitals are actually contracted at provincial level and are in high demand. But it does behoove each province to take care of its finances so that investors will be comfortable investing directly. And I think that's possible, by the way.
I see you nodding.
Yes, because it's not that I'm ambivalent about it.
Yeah.
I agree that it's possible, but I also agree that government has created incentives in many areas. If you look at the 100 megawatt dispensation from DMRE, it's decentralizing. It's saying Eskom doesn't have to be your sole provider for energy. So it's already doing that.
Yeah.
What we need to be cautious of and careful of is that when you have municipalities that are well off, that have great balance sheets, that can actually raise capital on their own, it works. But we have to make sure that we take care of all the citizens of our country. So it needs to be applied in a very thoughtful way. But the advantage of, and by the way, even if a municipality or province does this work, it's still undertaken by the private sector. They still procure the private sector. So whether it was national government or municipality or provincial government, it's still the private sector that will deliver the service on their behalf. The reason why it works is because it's a public-private partnership. Because private sector investors, whether it's the funder, whether it's the corporate, the developer, remember, lenders provide between 75 to 90% of the capital required for that piece of infrastructure. And the rest is provided by, government and the like. So there's definitely a rationale for doing it either way. But we have to think about the context of that municipality or that province and their ability to do it themselves.
I respect this principle of not leaving anyone behind. Just very briefly, one of the reasons why privatization sometimes sounds like a dirty word in South Africa is because there's this view that when the private sector comes in on a concession, once they start charging the user, it becomes expensive for an average person to use the surface. They start tolling and levying, etc., etc. And this is where the concerns come in with PPPs, is for the poorest amongst us. When they have to start paying back the debt incurred by the private sector, it just makes it really expensive.
Can I just say, the PPPs are not privatization.
I know that.
Not at all, because in a privatization, you would have a private party being able to take that asset and sell it freely on the market. the asset still belongs to the government. In fact, your returns are carefully managed. They are not super profits.
So I
The
think
good thing about it is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the good thing about it is that you actually have predictable returns for a long, long time. And it's from a risk perspective, it's less risky in infrastructure.
I think perhaps, I'm not saying this is privatization. I'm saying in South Africa, there's just a fear of privatization in general. And so when we talk PPPs and the concessioning, that to people looks like it's the same thing, because in the end, they're paying the debt incurred by the private sector. And you're just an ordinary South African now being made to pay a toll on a national road. And that's what makes people uncomfortable.
But you have a national road. That's the difference. So when government asks private sector to do something that they should be doing, a service they should be providing, somebody has to pay for it. It's not free. And you have certainty. You've got quality infrastructure that's well managed for years to come if you engage with private sector.
Okay, let's move the conversation along as we start to really crystallize all of our thoughts. And let's talk about sustainable infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, as you spoke about it earlier on, and what needs to be done in order to achieve this. And I'd like you to throw in the word decarbonization, because that's the word de jour. This is the future we're working towards, is moving away from fossil fuels into a greener, cleaner, more modern economy. So sustainability underpins everything, but what is it really going to look like, and what are the building blocks?
Well, the building blocks, first of all, you need to make sure that you can't impose a blunt instrument. You can't say we're closing down all coal-fired power plants today. You can't do that, because that's economic suicide from a GDP perspective, but also in terms of job losses. So you have to transition, and you have to transition carefully as you ramp up towards just green infrastructure. As you reduce your investment into carbon-intensive industries. And the rationale for doing that is because, quite simply, many of us, including the DBSA, the Development Finance Institutions, raise capital in the market from banks and funders who have shareholders, who have employees, who care about where the proceeds of that funding go. So we have to report on that. And they care about the environment, especially the young people of today. They care about us creating a sustainable future for them. So it's very important, as we decarbonize our economy, that we do that gradually, so that no one, as we say, is left behind.
Hassan Adam asks, is sustainability truly a reality for the majority of South Africans?
Absolutely. In fact, I dare say that you can't actually have, there's no exclusivity between economic development and sustainability. It's one thing. It's a package deal. In order for you to have a job in 10, 15 years, it has to be an industry that you will find other investors to invest in. There has to be a value chain, somebody you can export to, somebody you can import from. There has to be, you know, the European community are going to impose taxes, border taxes, on carbon countries, carbon-intensive countries. So we will not be able to export what we produce here, which means our skills will become irrelevant.
Is that blanket? So if you're a wine producer from the Western Cape and you're selling to the European Union, you're now going to, because you come from a carbon country, or is it if you're representing an industry?
Yes, and that industry is a carbon-intensive industry. So we're going to have problems. We're going to have jobs closing down if we don't transition. Fortunately, the world is alive to a transitioning journey, as opposed to tomorrow we want everything green. You know, it's a transitioning journey. And so it's up to us to make sure that as we do that, we take everybody along on that journey.
Just transitions occurred. That's also another terminology of the day. That is how you move the mining sector, the coal miners, all those carbon-intensive industries into this new era and minimize the damage or disruption.
Yeah, exactly. And so at COP26 in Glasgow fairly recently, you know, this whole just transition thing was a theme that was discussed, you know, at a, you know, almost continuously. And as a result of the positioning of, you know, how the South African delegates positioned South Africa, you know, we managed to walk away from that conference with a $8.5 billion commitment from developed nations in terms of helping us build the plan and start with this transition journey. Now, I think this just transition is going to be it's going to cost us a lot more than 8.5 billion, but it's a first step. And I think it's going to go a long way in helping us to crystallize the plans, that we have to follow in terms of getting to this just transition. But Catherine is saying, it is going to be a slow journey, and I think for some countries it's going to be slower than others. And for us, we have to acknowledge the fact that, we have and it's not just the coal miners, it's not just Exxaro, these, but it's but there's a whole value chain, of employees, transport companies, a big part of Transnet's income comes from, the railway network where they move coal, and you have the trucks as well, there's a whole value chain, that needs to adjust and that needs to adapt.
So anybody who's kind of at risk of being guilty of carbon emissions, it's them that have to sort of come into the picture. Okay, got it. Let me ask you a question, Ndabe, coming in from Manka Sebastian, who says, how can we standardize the measurement of a social return so that social infrastructure projects can show a holistic investment return? And she says in brackets, holistic being the commercial value and the social return. So how can we standardize how we measure this idea of impact when we're talking social infrastructure?
I think we need to agree on the taxonomy so that you will know exactly what green means, and there's no greenwashing. Once we agree on that taxonomy, how we classify things, then we should come up with a measurable impact and report on both the financial returns as well as the social returns. And I know some pension funds that have already started doing this, especially EPPF and others. So in my mind, it's understanding what the definitions are, the taxonomy, and therefore reporting on it deliberately. And I believe that will go a long way towards standardizing and ensuring that one can compare apples with apples.
And Cabot Althauser says, Kurt, we are never going to get pension funds to invest unless actuaries and asset managers can model the risk of these investments and integrate that into their asset and liability modeling. And most importantly, have meaningful benchmarks that can help them understand the value add. Now, who should be driving that initiative?
I think that's a really good point, but I think we are, and in the one sense, the fact that we've been relatively slow in implementing or investing in infrastructure from from the private sector's perspective means that we have the benefit of looking at what's happened in international markets. So we can actually see the level of risk that these projects have. And I have to say that, we've done a lot of research ourselves before we took the first steps in investing in infrastructure, did a lot of risk modeling, and we can see that, globally, that, for example, the default rates and the loss rates by investing in infrastructure is a lot lower than what, people often think. So I think there's been a lot of research, there's a lot of data available, but the asset owners as well as the asset managers, even the life insurance, companies, they've got big balance sheets. They all have a responsibility of doing the research, doing the asset allocation, but look at the facts, look at the data. I think people will realize that these investments are not always as risky as it seems.
Dilly Naidu asks, Catherine, what is the status of Transnet rail and ports infrastructure being fixed in capital letters since, if these are not working, it impacts business?
So Transnet has its own autonomy. It's not part of the DBSA.
No, we recognize that.
So they could probably explain that much better. But Transnet is actually currently busy with quite an extensive pipeline of capital investment into their infrastructure, ports, rail, everything. So they clearly recognize that they need to make sure that they maintain their infrastructure and make new investments, and very focused on how they do that also while they themselves are transitioning. So I think we should be encouraged. Transnet, there are a few, let me mention a few that might shock you, that are actually state-owned entities that were very well run. Eskom was one of them, by the way, world class. Transnet, Denel, very well run and can return to their former glory, I believe in many respects, maybe configured differently, but in many respects. So rest assured that Transnet is definitely working on that.
Okay.
I can maybe just add to that. So if, to your point, they were well run and they were financially very sustainable. And as a result of that, the private sector, because these entities also raised funding in the, in the public markets. And so, Transnet had access to a lot of capital. Unfortunately, that wasn't always, invested and managed, appropriately. But where they now is that they do find access to capital markets difficult. And as a result of that, they are now forced towards these private sector programs. And again, I think that will go a long way in solving the issues at an underlying asset level.
Okay. Vimlesh says ESG investment for Occurt. Government, are we still moving for Occurt and government? That's you, of course. Listen, Catherine, ESG investment. Are we still moving ahead with the push for ESG investments when Germany has shelved its ESG rules since the start of the Ukraine war? So there's an extenuating circumstance there, and we're seeing them going back to a little bit of coal to get energy. And so has Goldman Sachs and BlackRock also ditched the green activism over the Russia nuclear energy. I think what we need to establish is whether this is a temporary situation, Russia and Ukraine, and just because everybody's surviving, they're going to ditch their ESG rules, or does it introduce a completely new regime in an era?
I think it's a very difficult question. But I think it almost comes back to the whole idea around the just transition, understanding that you can't move forward with, for example, taking the environmental risks and putting that sort of, as a, making that so important that any decision you take, sort of blind to all the other realities that you face. And I think you have to take, for example, our socioeconomic situation into consideration. The fact that 85%, I think, of our energy comes from coal, our transition is going to be slower. Maybe Germany and France and Europe, they've now been forced into this temporary reversal of, the progress that they might have made. But I think you have to take, as circumstances change, you have to take it into consideration. I think the way we think about ESG is that there are environmental risks in making certain investment decisions. You need to take those risks into consideration, governance risks and social risks that need to be taken into consideration.
Is this a loophole, Catherine, do you think, for governments to sort of say, I've been waiting for some breather and here it is, and we're going to go back to getting a little bit more coal into the system because we've got a justification now, or it's just really temporary?
It's situational. Infrastructure is a long-term game. Infrastructure planning is a long-term game and delivery. So we understand the conversations that are currently going on. We understand even what the Europeans are doing currently. We're pressurizing the rest of Africa, who is probably the least contributor to where we are in terms of carbon emissions. But for us, it is not a situational, it's a journey that we've started, and it's ongoing.
And Ndabe, just in terms of the questions that are coming through, okay, go ahead, Catherine.
No, go ahead.
Okay, and there's a question coming through, and it has Sanlam in it and cancelling tenders, etc., etc. But the issue here is expertise. Whatever happens, is there expertise in the country to roll out these projects, especially the ones of the future that we're talking about? Because earlier in the conversation, we also spoke about the fact that PPPs work because there's expertise in the private sector that can be leveraged. Is that sufficient expertise to make sure that projects reach their completion?
There is sufficient expertise to get going with some of the projects that can be done, especially in the renewable energy space. And it actually, as we start doing more, we'll be able to attract more of that skill, whether locally or internationally. And so some of the other projects will also need to actually get international skills. But if we don't do the stop and start, if we continue, we'll then be able to grow our own timber and be able to deliver well into the future. And we cannot stop and say, well, we don't have skills in South Africa, therefore we're not going to do the right things. We will import where we need to and make sure that we get going. And I'd like to go back to some of the things I've been trying to interject. I think ESG is not something that we want to do just because Germany wants to do it. We want to do it because not only do we want to make enough money to retire on, but we also want our members to retire in a sustainable world where they're not still, breathing polluted air. So we've got a number of corporates who are wanting to transition into renewable energy. And it's not just government driving this. corporates are going to continue putting those assets, and I think they will not stop because of this. And whatever is being done, obviously, is going to be done in a sustainable manner that also takes the just transition into account.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've really come to the end of our conversation. And so now, so much has been spoken about, from financial models to PPE to what we mean by infrastructure for good. What are the thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with? Let's start with you, Ndabe, in the United States. Infrastructure for good holistically.
It's certainly, if you look at an asset that can deliver returns that are durable, that can match a pension's liabilities, infrastructure is good. If you look at the risk that it has, actually, infrastructure debt has lower risk than some investment grade corporate debt. And if you look at the impact that it drives, it leads to job creating growth. It is something that the world is doing and putting a large chunk of their money in it. South Africa needs to play catch up and do so, and do it quickly, because our own survival depends on it.
I would like to add on to what Ndabe said. I think the fact is that if we're serious about fighting unemployment, about fighting poverty in South Africa, lifting the level of investment in infrastructure is absolutely crucial. Yeah. I think the quality of infrastructure in a country really determines the quality of life. You know, like you said earlier, if you flick a switch, does the light go on? If you open a tap, you know, do you have running water? You know, how easy is it to get access to decent schooling? How easy is it to get access to health facilities? I just recently read, I think last week, I think they cancelled something like 800 or 900 medical procedures at the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. You know, those sort of things, it really has a direct impact on people's, you know, day-to-day experience of life and the quality of life. And I think by lifting the level of investment, we have a real chance of not only lifting the economic capacity in the country, but also just really improving people's day-to-day lives.
Catherine Kaufman, I'd like to give you the last word.
Infrastructure for good. You know, I used to think that when we fund school education, it's about funding quality education. Yeah. Who cares about the buildings? Yeah. It's about the education you get at the end of the day. But there's very clear empirical evidence that shows that when you're in a school that's functional, it's got a science lab, it's got good lighting, good ventilation, energy supply, connectivity, ICT, water and sanitation, dignity. What happens is that, first of all, the completion cycle for scholars is improved 100%. Academic results, there's a link between academic results, which you achieve when you have the right infrastructure in place, infrastructure for good, and opportunities for those scholars that graduate from those schools to go into universities or colleges or job opportunities, which eventually contribute to the economy. And that, for me, is the definition of infrastructure for good. It eventually gives us all the same access to dignity.
Yeah, and I think that's a really poignant place to leave it there. You know, we may think it's about the experience, for instance, of being in school, the quality of the teachers, but it's both. It's how you're experiencing the school will also influence how you experience the teachers, and the same metaphorically is true for the hospitals, for your workspace, for the community in which you live, how secure you feel, how dignified you can be as a resident in this country. And that is why we've had this discussion on infrastructure for good. It's a conversation that's been brought to us by Sanlam Investments. It's a conversation about South Africa and the country we envisage, the aspirations we have for this nation. Because if we don't start now, then when? It's not about you and me. It's about the future we hope to see, but definitely that's there for prosperity. Again, please keep the conversation going. #Critical Conversations, #Infrastructure for Good. Remember to tag us at Sanlam Investments. It's been this edition of Critical Conversations. We thank you all for your brilliant questions. We'll see you again next time.